Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, John Cho is frantically searching for his missing daughter. David Kim, played by John Cho, has been trying to handle raising his 16-year-old daughter, Margot, played by Michelle La, after his wife Pamela, played by Sarah Son, died of cancer 2 years ago. Then, late one night, he sleeps through his daughter calling him, and the next day, Margot has disappeared. With the aid of Detective Vic, played by Deborah Messing, David begins logging into Margot's computer and social media accounts, becoming increasingly desperate as he tries to figure out why she went missing. As he learns more and more secrets that Margot kept from him, David discovers that he may not know his daughter as much as he thought he did. Searching is the directorial debut of Anish Changati and is set exclusively through a perspective of technology, not just computer desktops, so that takes up a large majority of the running time, but also things like FaceTime, surveillance footage, YouTube, and so on and so forth. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, that does sound a little bit familiar, well, chances are you probably have seen a film like this before, be it the Elijah Wood movie Open Windows, but more likely, chances are you've probably seen the Unfriended films, which were set exclusively through computer desktops. In fact, just a few weeks ago we had the sequel, Dark Web. And there is actually a connection between Searching and the Unfriended films that goes beyond the fact they both share the same framing device. In fact, they also share the same producer, Tamer Bekmambetov, who is the Russian director behind Wanted and Night Watch. And there is actually a very sneaky nod to Unfriended for fans of that series, just a little playful kind of cool attention to it. Very early on, when a character's browsing through Facebook, look up in where the news articles would be, and you'll see the name Laura Barnes there. Laura Barnes, of course, being the name of the ghost that terrorizes the characters in the first Unfriended. So, I guess they're set in the same universe now? I guess? Either way, there is a reason why movies are increasingly moving towards this format. Searching uses it in a very fascinating way. While a lot of the other previous entries have largely been horror movies, instead, this film uses it to tell a mystery, and in doing so, I think there's a real kind of novelty about it. I certainly haven't seen any other movies that tell this kind of story this particular way, and also, it makes it feel very, very contemporary. Technology is increasingly becoming a part of our everyday lives, whether we like it or not, and Searching establishes this right from the very outset. The film begins with a montage of David and Pamela's relationship, but also Margot as she grows up. What this sets up is not just the human relationships of the characters within the story, but how they use technology as well, how we use technology, as David is entering in significant dates into the calendar or uploading photos and video of Margot. We use computers every day as the keeper of our most personal, intimate secrets and treasured moments. And as the family grows, so too does technology change around them. David moves from a Windows XP desktop to a Mac desktop. You get the sense that this is a very happy family, and yet we don't see what's happening outside the computer screen, but we get a sense of what's going on. Or do we? There is a slight semblance of omission, because the time is skipping so quickly. But it's only really keenly felt when Pamela starts to become ill as her condition deteriorates, and it's a case of she's in the photos one moment and then she's gone the next. And that's surprisingly poignant when you're seeing it all play out like this. What this does is establishes the desktop as its own kind of editor, controlling what we can and cannot see at any given moment. And this is very pivotal to a mystery thriller, which are all about perspective. It's the same way that a real editor on a traditional film would choose what angle or where to cut. Here, it's a case of moving between videos or text articles. And I do have to admit, it did take me a little bit of a while to get fully adjusted to the format, but once I did acclimatise to it, I did realise that it does have a kind of strangely cinematic vibe to it. And you wouldn't necessarily think that, because our relationship with technology has become so commonplace that it's borderline domestic, and that's how you would describe a lot of the first half of this movie to a certain extent. And yet, Chang'e does actually tell a really compelling story, not just because of the format, but through it as well. He also exerts a bit more directorial influence than you would normally expect out of a film like this. Often, its other peers, like Unfriended, will plough it in something close to real time. With the story that Searching tells, that's simply not possible. It spans over several days, so there's obviously going to be ellipses, and so there is actually a bit more editing, as it were, than you would normally see in a film like this, where they would try to cover it up with invisible cuts as they move between various windows. In Searching's case, there is actually close-ups and other various editorial movements. To give you an example of what I mean by this, imagine a FaceTime conversation being up on screen like there are several instances in this movie. You know how when you're talking in that, there's a little window of your camera in the bottom of the screen? What Searching does is that it will cut to that smaller window, almost as a pseudo shot reverse shot, as it were, in, out, and so on and so forth. And there'll be other moments where they'll cut in closer to emphasise something that David is looking at on the screen. And that is something that I think is quite unique to this movie. I haven't seen other examples of this, and yet it makes sense. It amplifies the cinematic potential of this very story without feeling like it's static, without feeling like it's a one whole continuous shot. I just found the perspective of this movie really fascinating because it tells us a lot about the characters just simply by existing. I think that there is something really kind of personal about the whole point of view that the film takes, and sometimes the movie understands that and mines that for emotional advantage. Like, for example, there is a sequence where David is forced to return to his old computer. He's greeted by a desktop background of his late wife. That hits like an emotional gut punch, especially at this point in the story where he's concerned that he might have lost his daughter as well. That has real significant weight to it. But it also underlines how, because of the way that we use technology, the things that we leave behind, they almost become like time capsules just waiting to be opened up by a mouse click, as it were, and it's strangely affecting. And what's at the heart of this movie is a generation gap. I think the movie understands that two generations use technology in very different ways. David uses it and it's very functional. He uses it for work, he's typing out spreadsheets. Margot uses it as an emotional outlet, like I think a lot of young people her age do, and she's very connected on social media, be it Facebook, Tumblr, or a live streaming app called Ucast. She's on all those different platforms, and in doing so, she creates a persona for herself. And I think the film definitely understands that people use this as a way of kind of liberating themselves and expressing themselves in a way that they simply can't offline. There is a literal disconnect that I think amplifies the rift between father and daughter that has occurred since Pamela's passing. They haven't quite been able to talk or express themselves. Margot deals with it by hiding it in this own personal world. And so if David is going to reconnect with her and find her, he's going to have to venture in there and discover her secrets and discover her most personal, intimate thoughts, things that are going to change the way that he thinks about her and confront how he views her. And it's difficult, it's a hard process, and the movie keeps piling on the turns. Every time that David moves onto a different webpage, it reveals something different about her, something that completely blindsides him. There are real emotional stakes, because at the centre of this movie, it's very much about parent-child relationships, and again, how they view the world very differently. I mean, this is the kind of movie where David at one point asks, "What's Tumblr?" probably echoing a question that many people over 30 have asked. And as David gets deeper and deeper into her world, every photo, every video, every post becomes its own kind of clue. And that's where the fun begins, because this is a good old-fashioned mystery told in a brand new way that makes it feel very fresh and innovative. And I do have to give it credit for its genre, because really it is a very well constructed mystery, and it doesn't cheat. The pieces are all there, it lays them all out for you, and you're trying to work it out alongside the characters. The film invites you to do this, and you might work out certain things ahead of time, but that's part of the enjoyment of it. This is a film that very much seems like it's made for an audience. It very much has its own kind of social engagement, much like social media on the internet. And so I think that that's really interesting, and that's exacerbated by the shift that the film has roughly around the halfway point. The first half of this movie is very intimate, not only due to the POV, but there is a very small cast. We have David, Margot and Vic as main characters, and they pretty much carry us through the first 45 minutes of the movie alone, and it's largely just David trying to track down his daughter by himself, trying to find whatever information he can, and then, after a certain point, the net expands dramatically wider. It becomes very, very public. And at that point, the perspective shifts away from David, and we start to get an incorporation of more of the internet. And I think, to the film's credit, it really does understand how the internet works, the way that people react to the ongoing investigation, the way that they make careless accusations. That's something that you see on the internet every single day. You really get a sense of the really negative, nasty side of the internet that likes to live off the drama of these kind of events. And the movie kind of has fun with that. Sometimes it plays it quite seriously, other times it will use it for comical effect, and I think that Chang'e does a really good job of managing the tone. And the movie uses that in its own kind of playful way to misdirect us to a certain extent. It tries to throw you off the scent. However, at this point, it's where David's character also begins to shift, because what John Cho brings to his performance is this very clean-cut, devoted father, but is maybe a little bit absentee, and there is this real driving sense that he is going to find his daughter. He is determined all the way through the film, and that determination starts to curdle. He starts to become quite ill-tempered and increasingly just simply desperate. He starts doing things that are really quite unethical, and I have to commend John Cho for his performance in this film, because he pretty much carries a large majority of this movie simply by himself. The only other big name in this film is Deborah Messing, and she pops up intermittently as Detective Vic, who is mostly there for exposition purposes. She's there to give him information on the case as it goes on, and really she's very much a by-the-book cop. She is the voice of authority, and she's there to try and direct him as and where needed. But for the most part, this is very much Cho's show, and as a one-man movie, he really impresses. He really makes a character that could have been a cipher in other people's hands and makes him quite human and realistic, I think. And that's really commendable. He manages to overcome the technology of the movie to a certain extent, because this is very much a movie that, because of the way that it's framed, could come across as being a bit sterile. But in this case, I think that he really sells the emotions of the character as he begins to doubt what he even knows about his daughter. And as David begins to crack and become more volatile, it suddenly occurred to me that there's a much darker version of this film just under the surface, occasionally threatening to burst out in its later stages. And there is this sense, even in the very film's perspective, that it's not just intimate, It's voyeuristic. We are imposing ourselves upon David's screen. We are witness to his own thoughts as he types them out and then self-edits himself. There's something weirdly kind of creepy about it that the movie doesn't quite know what to do with. To give a Hitchcockian analogy, it's almost like we're Jimmy Stewart peeking through Raymond Burr's window, except in this case, it's multiple windows on a screen. I was definitely thinking this when the film reached a certain event about 3/4 of the way through, and I thought that this was going to be the climax of the movie, and I thought that this is where they were going to end it, and I did actually think to myself that if they end it like this, it would be an extremely bold and rather haunting move, and it would be really, really effective. And I get the sense that the film tries to deliberately invoke that to a certain extent. It tries to do it intentionally, but it never quite goes through with it, and I was disappointed in that, because I definitely think that there is a point in this movie where it could have stopped. There is definitely a point where it passes where it should have ended, and it kind of goes on for just a little bit too long, in my opinion. Without giving anything away, the movie goes into a fourth act. The final 15 to 20 minutes felt unnecessary to me. This isn't because the movie suddenly pulls something completely out of nowhere. Like I said, it's all set up. The problem was, I simply wasn't convinced by it, and that's a harsh criticism to label a film like this, where they clearly went to so much effort to make it credible. I don't think people really realise how hard it is to do a film about screens on screen, because it has to be so precise. We're so familiar with these things that we can pick out the faults, and yet everything feels very accurate on screen, and as such, it builds a verisimilitude that manages to grip the audience in the story. And so, when it reaches this certain point, it's a real shame. I was thrown out of the movie because I just didn't believe that this sequence of events would occur, to be really honest. And what really kind of adds salt into the wound is that the movie had shown me the route that it could have possibly taken if it was bolder, if the filmmakers had a bit more courage of their convictions. Instead, they choose the route that's a lot neater, and that really disappointed me. Nevertheless, I do recommend searching. If you like a good old-fashioned mystery like this, definitely check this movie out. It uses the format in a very novel and engaging way, and I think as a debut feature, it really is a very clever piece of work that shows that Changate is definitely a filmmaker that we're going to have to look out for in the future. I think he definitely shows signs of real potential in this movie. I think that while I do have reservations about this ending, overall, it's a very solid piece of work, especially for a first-timer. Although not the first film to be set largely through computer desktops, Searching nevertheless manages to use the format to tell a fairly intriguing mystery in a way that feels timely and relevant. If nothing else, it understands how social media and the internet works, often for tension, occasionally for comic effect, and the identities that we create online, using machines to document and express our lives. The film successfully used this for drama on both a personal micro level, and then later on a macro level as the investigation becomes more public and exploited, with John Cho effectively portraying someone driven to the realms of obsession and guilt in trying to learn about his child, let alone find her. There is definitely a darker film trying to break out of Searching, given the voyeurism of its central premise, but despite flirting with that, it sadly refuses to commit to it. The final section of the film loses the credibility that the movie spent so much time setting up. Regardless, Searching is worth logging into. If you like this review, then you can log on to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.